Policy debate often forces a choice between two very different models of decision-making, the closed logic of the round and the messy reality of actual governance. In competitive rounds, it is standard practice to allow negative teams nearly infinite hypothetical scenarios to test a proposed plan. This tradition has entrenched two dominant strategies, the uniform 50-state counterplan and the politics disadvantage. These arguments operate like mathematical proofs. They assume a completely frictionless political universe, where complex legislation can be neatly swapped, blocked, or reassigned without resistance. But subject these perfect theories to actual legal and historical scrutiny, and the mechanics break down. A judge in a debate round might accept a sweeping claim about political capital out of theoretical obligation, but a real-world policy expert reads that same text looking for concrete operational constraints. To accurately evaluate policy literature, we have to evaluate evidence the way its intended audience does. That means rejecting contrived, extrinsic comparisons and recognizing that state-level action carries inescapable federal entanglements. Relying on these generic strategies doesn't actually test the affirmative plan. It relies on a complete distortion of how federalism and legislative scheduling actually work. Evaluating evidence requires a hermeneutic approach. We have to ask what would persuade the specific interested reader the author originally addressed, someone weighing tangible solutions, not abstract theories. This lens exposes the flaw in the politics disadvantage. The argument assumes that passing one specific policy directly depletes the political capital needed for another, treating the legislative agenda as a zero-sum game. This animated diagram maps out the congressional schedule to show how the legislature actually routes its workload. According to political scientist George Edwards, Congress operates through extreme decentralization. Policies are considered serially. Because jurisdiction is divided across specialized subcommittees, a debate over education reform does not inherently block a debate over healthcare. The two items run on parallel tracks. When authors propose a policy, they write with the understanding that legislative leaders know how to manage a calendar. Passing one bill does not automatically erase another. Political pundits frequently make confident forecasts about legislative trade-offs, but data collected by Philip Tetlock shows these predictions statistically fail. Politics is driven by shifting values and uncertainty, making exact capital trade-offs impossible to map accurately. The same logic applies to policy side effects. Public health and legal scholars Lawrence Gostin and Seth Wetter point out that ethical policymaking requires confronting foreseeable trade-offs. If a major initiative, like shifting to renewable energy, causes job losses in the fossil fuel sector, decision-makers do not abandon the energy policy. Instead, they build mitigation into the legislative response. They pass worker retraining programs or economic subsidies alongside the core initiative. The primary policy remains intact, while secondary measures address the downstream harms. Because of this, extrinsic objections do not function as decisive opportunity costs. Finding alternative causes or related trade-offs justifies additional legislative action. It does not justify rejecting the affirmative plan. This standard for opportunity costs extends beyond Congress. We can see exactly how decision-makers evaluate trade-offs by looking at historical executive actions. Consider the Truman administration's debate over the use of nuclear weapons. This decision tree outlines the administration's primary operational goal, demonstrating an absolute will to use massive force against the enemy. Advisors seeking to prevent a strike on a populated area could propose an alternative, bombing critical oil infrastructure instead. That proposal represents a valid intrinsic alternative. The enemy heavily depended on oil, meaning a strike on a refinery complex would achieve the exact same operational goal of demonstrating massive force. Now look at the alternative. When advisors argued Truman should bomb a different city for unrelated reasons, he dismissed the proposal as a waste of time. Because these extrinsic alternatives failed to engage his actual objectives, Truman viewed them as distractions. This frustration with irrelevant options only increased his confidence that his original target was the necessary choice. We see the same pattern in the 1993 Bosnia crisis. Foreign policy scholar Nicholas Vostev observed the consequences of prioritizing high-flown rhetoric over rational calculation. Critics condemned intervention on abstract moral grounds without offering any practical, intrinsic alternative. That delay resulted in thousands of casualties, only for the U.S. to eventually adopt an intervention strategy nearly identical to the one initially proposed. Policy debate is designed to model this real-world decision logic. If an expert advisor would set aside an extrinsic alternative as irrelevant to the core mission, then a counterplan based on that alternative provides no reason to reject the plan. In these cases, logic dictates that the decision-maker must favor the affirmative. This brings us to the specific mechanics of the state's counterplan. The negative strategy relies on the assumption that 50 states can act with perfect uniformity while cleanly severing all federal involvement. But constitutional law dictates otherwise in this scenario. Imposing true 50-state uniformity instantly triggers overarching federal legal structures. This flowchart illustrates the legal consequences of state coordination. According to constitutional scholar Ilya Shapiro, when states form compacts to ensure uniform legislation, those interstate compacts are legally recognized as equivalent to federal law, which explicitly requires congressional consent. Even without formal compacts, divergent state budgets and case law create cross-state spillovers. Legal analysis by Manet and colleagues shows that large states use their market power to compel nationwide compliance, overriding the policies of smaller states. That economic spillover leads to the ultimate constitutional trigger, the Commerce Clause. The federal government possesses both the authority and the responsibility to prevent one state's policies from imposing economic harms across state lines. When state laws create inherently interstate market effects, Congress is forced to intervene and clarify how state regulations interact with federal standards. Furthermore, strict 50-state fiat ignores federal jurisdictions that disrupt uniform implementation, such as the direct federal authority over non-state territories like Wake Island. Other legal realities, like delegation analysis under the Lopez decision and the necessity of federal compensation for uneven state funding, ensure federal agencies remain actively involved. Debate coach Ryan Galloway notes the danger here. Assigning inherently federal issues to the states distorts the entire literature base. It collapses the model of federalism into an incoherent free-for-all, where any issue can be reassigned at will. Tactically, this makes the permutation to do both completely valid. The resulting policy inevitably preserves federal agency action, operating alongside state implementation. The negative cannot fiat true uniformity across 50 states without creating a patchwork that demands federal coordination. Because federal involvement is inescapable, the supposed opportunity cost of the counterplan is rendered moot. Both infinite hypotheticals and uniform state fiat fail the test of real-world governance. They abandon actual constraints in favor of debate theory. Policy debate serves to educate participants on how to evaluate competing research. This objective requires a comparison of evidence that would persuade an average reader, one who is open to a policy's actual costs, but grounded by the realities of how society functions. The true burden of the negative is clear. They must prove the affirmative actively sacrifices a better, feasible solution that addresses the exact same concerns. We can evaluate any generic negative strategy using a simple two-part heuristic. 1. Are the harms intrinsic to the plan? And 2, is the opportunity cost grounded in real-world advocacy? Judges should disregard negative claims that fail this test. Arguments that rely on contrived comparisons do not reflect the literature, because no actual researcher evaluates policy that way. Allowing specific domestic topics to be constantly outweighed by highly speculative foreign policy war scenarios or impossible 50-state fiats directly harms the activity. It chokes off meaningful research into the actual issues. To preserve the intellectual rigor of policy debate, the community has to ground its comparisons squarely in the established literature. It is time to leave the era of infinite, frictionless fiat behind.
Imagine you're standing at a crossroads. You're trying to make this really major life decision.
Right, like maybe you're considering a new job or finally moving to a completely new city.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you've done all the research, your logic is totally sound, and you're ready to commit. But right as you take that first step, someone taps you on the shoulder.
And they drop a massive hypothetical on you.
Right. They say, but wait, what if taking that job somehow causes this massive butterfly effect and completely ruins the local economy in 3 years?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And suddenly you're paralyzed. You aren't being stopped by a real tangible flaw in your plan. You're being stopped by this phantom what if.
It is a remarkably effective psychological trap. I mean, we experience it in our personal lives all the time, but it gets magnified on this massive structural level when we look at how national policies are debated.
Oh, for sure.
We just get so bogged down in these hypothetical trade-offs and wildly unrelated alternatives that the actual concrete problem sitting right in front of us goes completely unsolved.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. Our mission today is to cut through that exact kind of paralysis.
Absolutely.
We're going to learn how to identify when an argument against a new idea is actually valid and when it's really just a contrived comparison designed to distract you.
And to do this, we're pulling from a genuinely fascinating paper from May 2026, published by the Debate AI Institute. It's titled, Debating Real-World Comparison Excludes States, Counterplan, and Politics.
Yeah, it's a bit dense, but the insights are incredible. And the source material actually includes this striking piece of visual art that perfectly anchors everything we're going to explore.
Right, it's this dramatic cinematic landscape. You have these two diverging winding roads. One road leads to a giant red Republican elephant, and the other leads to this huge blue Democratic donkey.
And eventually, both of these roads converge right on the United States Capitol building, all under this brilliant glowing sunburst.
It's a very powerful image.
It is. And just to set the record straight right up front, we are absolutely not taking political sides here today.
No, not at all.
We're just using this artwork exactly as it's presented in the source as a visual metaphor for political gridlock, diverging ideological paths, and the way everything eventually just collides at the federal level.
Right. But there is one crucial detail in this image that we really need to point out. Right on the side of this winding road, there is a standard-looking speed limit sign.
Yeah, and it doesn't say 65 or 70, it just says 50.
Exactly. Keep that number in mind as you're listening, because that 50 is the key to dismantling a massive illusion about how we actually govern.
So the overarching goal for you, the listener, is to understand the actual mechanics of decision making. We want to decode how lawmakers, judges, and even like professional debaters evaluate real world policies without getting trapped in those phantom what ifs.
Let's start right at the Capitol building from our image. There's this persistent myth about how the political agenda actually functions.
Oh, the zero-sum idea, right?
Yeah. People assume that doing policy A automatically means we absolutely cannot do policy B. It's this idea that every single issue is trapped in this massive cage match, fighting to the death for a limited spot on the legislative calendar.
But the research shows that assumption is just completely divorced from reality.
Completely. The paper brings up a concept called the hermeneutic theory of interpretation. And while it sounds incredibly academic, the application is highly practical.
Right. It basically dictates that when you evaluate evidence or an argument, you have to look at it in the exact context of what a real-world decision maker would actually care about.
Right. You have to ask what would realistically persuade an informed reader facing a concrete concern rather than getting lost in all these theoretical abstractions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if I'm a real-world decision maker,
Right.
I don't view every single problem as competing for the exact same 5 minutes of my time.
No, of course not. The paper actually cites political scientist George Edwards from his 2000 work, pointing out that Congress really operates through intense decentralization.
They evaluate policies serially, meaning issue by issue, right?
Exactly. They divide jurisdiction, they specialize their expertise. The massive workload is distributed among dozens of different simultaneous committees.
So passing an education bill in one committee doesn't just magically halt a healthcare bill in another.
No, they operate simultaneously.
It reminds me of a massive decentralized restaurant kitchen. Like the chef at Station 1 grilling a burger doesn't somehow remove the ability of the chef at Station 2 to chop a salad.
I love that. Yes.
They're completely decentralized. So this whole talking point that we can't fix, say, our bridges because we used up all our political capital fixing the schools, I mean, it's a total fiction.
The kitchen analogy holds up beautifully. And the implication of that decentralization is huge. When critics argue that solving a specific problem will ruin the political capital needed for a totally unrelated problem.
It's just a distraction.
Exactly. They're offering a contrived comparison. No real-world researcher evaluates policy that way. In fact, the paper points to research by Philip Tetlock from 2017.
Oh, the forecasting stuff.
Right. He tracks how experts and political pundits constantly make these confident-sounding forecasts about political trade-offs. They go on television and claim that passing one bill will absolutely doom the rest of an administration's agenda.
But statistically, those pundits fail to predict those trade-offs accurately, like almost every time.
Because politics isn't driven by predictable zero-sum logic. It's driven by values, by shifting coalitions, and by sheer chaotic uncertainty.
So we are literally letting statistically unlikely political roadblocks stop us from taking necessary action.
Exactly.
But, I mean, policies do have real side effects. We can't just pretend every plan is flawless. How do ethical policymakers handle the consequences that actually happen without just throwing their hands up in defeat?
Well, the paper relies on work by Gostin and Wetter from 2022 to answer that. They argue that ethical policymaking absolutely requires confronting foreseeable trade-offs.
Right, you can't just stick your head in the sand.
No, you can't. But the critical distinction is how you confront them. You do not confront a trade-off by abandoning the policy entirely.
Let's ground this for a second. Look at a massive push for renewable energy.
Great example.
That transition is going to severely strain employment in fossil fuel sectors, and it might even complicate certain foreign trade relations.
Yeah, absolutely will.
But if you're an ethical decision maker, you don't look at the potential job losses in the coal industry and say, well, I guess we just have to abandon renewable energy and let climate change run rampant.
Right. You implement retraining programs for those displaced workers. You adjust your trade strategies to accommodate the new energy landscape.
So alternative causes justify additional action. They mitigate the side effects.
Exactly. They do not justify rejecting the core plan. The original policy to shift to renewables remains intact, while you take secondary measures to address the secondary harms.
You know, the sources mention a rule of thumb from a book called Write Like a Leader that connects this to formal debate resolutions.
Oh, right, the colon rule.
Yeah. In a formal resolution, the focus is exclusively on the wording that comes right after the colon, after the word resolved. The affirmative side is only responsible for defending the intrinsic mechanisms of that specific plan.
And understanding that difference between an intrinsic alternative and an extrinsic alternative is basically the ultimate filter for cutting through political noise.
The paper actually provides a really stark historical example of this, involving President Truman and the decision to use nuclear weapons.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does the intrinsic versus extrinsic argument play out in a decision with that much gravity?
Well, Truman's advisors who wanted to dissuade him from using the bomb, they had to present alternatives.
Naturally.
And some proposed striking Japanese oil infrastructure instead. That is an intrinsic alternative.
Right, because it directly engaged with Truman's actual underlying goal, which was to demonstrate this massive will to use force to compel a surrender.
Exactly. Since the enemy was heavily dependent on oil, bombing the infrastructure was a logical, direct alternative to the core concern.
But other advisors suggested bombing a completely random city for entirely unrelated reasons, just to show military might without using the nuclear option.
And to Truman, Those were extrinsic alternatives. They were completely disconnected from the core strategic equation he was wrestling with.
Right. And presenting those extrinsic alternatives actually made Truman more certain of his original plan.
Wow.
Yeah. The intrinsic alternative engaged the real decision. The extrinsic one was just seen as a distraction.
And that distraction isn't just some abstract annoyance. It can have a massive human cost.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources bring up the 1993 Bosnia crisis. A researcher named Gvozdev noted in 2005 that during that crisis, critics relied heavily on high-flown words and moral condemnations without proposing any practical intrinsic alternatives to intervention.
Right. And the result of throwing around hypothetical objections without a concrete countersolution was that thousands of people died due to delayed intervention.
That's horrifying.
It is. When we entertain abstract extrinsic criticisms without forcing the critic to provide a workable intrinsic alternative, we end up paying for that delay with real suffering.
Okay, but I have to push back a little on this framework.
Sure.
If we always default to saying, well, that's an extrinsic concern, we'll fix the side effects later, aren't we running the risk of ignoring massive opportunity costs? Like, what happens when a critic brings up an alternative that seems genuinely brilliant, but it involves so many new variables that we just can't possibly test it in the moment?
That's a really fair question.
Don't we have a duty to consider it rather than just dismissing it as extrinsic?
What's fascinating here is how the paper addresses that exact tension regarding the limits of human bandwidth.
Okay.
Infinite hypotheticals kill comparative research. If someone introduces a massive, complex, but completely extrinsic alternative, basically changing the subject to a totally new universe of variables, we simply do not have the time to adequately research it and test its truth in the moment.
Right, because our resources and our time are finite. We can't just pause the world to run a 10-year study on a hypothetical tangent.
Exactly. The paper argues that if we do not have the time to adequately research an argument to test its validity, we must presume against its validity.
Otherwise, we're just rewarding people for using well-extended jargon.
We are letting a high-sounding hypothetical parlay into complete inaction.
Which brings us right back to that speed limit sign in our opening visual, the number 50.
Yes, the 50.
Because if there is one supreme, jargon-filled hypothetical distraction in the world of policy evaluation, it is the 50 states argument.
The state's counterplan. It is an incredibly common, contrived alternative used in both policy debates and real-world political rhetoric.
The premise is that whenever the federal government tries to do something like regulate a new technology, or protect a waterway, or implement a standard to the killer, a critic will argue that the federal government shouldn't do it at all.
Right.
Instead, they propose that all 50 individual states should uniformly enact the exact same legislation entirely on their own.
And it sounds appealing because it plays on these ideas of federalism and local control, you know?
But the source material completely dismantles this. The idea of 50 state uniform action is a complete mirage.
It really is.
So what does this all mean in a practical sense? Because to me, arguing that 50 independent state legislatures will spontaneously and uniformly agree on a complex regulatory framework, it's like trying to get 50 college roommates to all perfectly agree to clean a massive kitchen without a landlord ever stepping in.
That is a wildly chaotic visual, but it's spot on.
Right. Like one roommate cleans the sink, 3 refuse to buy soap, and 5 of them just start throwing trash out the window. Eventually, you absolutely need top-down coordination because spontaneous uniform agreement is a fantasy.
And the legal scholarship backs up that reality entirely. The paper cites Shapiro from 2016, who points out a massive constitutional hurdle with this idea.
Oh, really? What kind of hurdle?
Well, when states actually attempt to create these massive uniform compacts with each other to bypass the federal government, those compacts are legally upgraded.
Upgraded? To what?
To the status of federal law. Under the Constitution, interstate compacts require congressional consent to actually be valid.
Wait, so the very act of the states trying to act uniformly to exclude the federal government legally loops the federal government right back in?
Exactly. It's a paradox. And it goes beyond just legal technicalities into brutal economic reality.
How so?
Well, there's a 2025 study by Mann and colleagues highlighting that states are simply not equal in power. Large states use their massive market power to compel nationwide compliance with their specific policies, which effectively overrides the sovereignty of smaller states.
Oh, a perfect real-world example of this is auto emissions, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because if California sets a strict emission standard for cars, automakers like Ford or Toyota aren't going to build a completely separate, less efficient car just for Nevada.
No, the assembly line cost would be astronomical.
Right, they just adopt the California standard nationwide.
So California's market power effectively legislates for the rest of the country. And this creates cross-state harms, or what economists call spillovers.
Aye.
And when one state's laws start dictating the economic reality of another state, Congress is forced to act under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The federal government has the authority and the structural responsibility to step in and standardize interstate commerce.
And the sources list several other areas where the federal government is basically inescapable no matter how much you want to rely on the state.
Yeah, there's the whole issue of non-state territories.
Right, places like Wake Island are unincorporated territories. They aren't governed by any of the 50 states.
So if you devolve a national policy purely to state legislatures, these territories just fall into a jurisdictional black hole.
Which is wild. And the paper also touches on delegation analysis under the 1995 Supreme Court case, United States v. Lopez.
Right, Lopez. While that case did set limits on federal overreach, it also really highlighted the complex overlapping boundaries between state and federal power.
The federal government delegates authority, sure, but it rarely just vacates a field entirely.
Never. Furthermore, because states have vastly uneven funding capabilities, the federal government is always needed to provide financial compensation and coordination. You just can't escape it.
Okay, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, The state's counterplan doesn't actually sever federal involvement at all.
Not even a little bit. Whether through congressional consent for compacts or the Commerce Clause regulating market spillovers or just federal funding mechanisms, federal agencies are structurally embedded in nationwide policy.
So the entire argument is just a smokescreen.
Completely. Its purpose is to shield political blame while actively destroying reliable research.
The paper actually cites a 2020 article by Ryan Galloway exploring the damage this does. Galloway points out that debaters and politicians will argue that almost anything can be kicked back to the states,
which actively distorts the literature base.
Yeah. He notes arguments suggesting that federal nuclear policy, or federal transportation, or federal lands should all be handled individually by the 50 states.
Treating federal nuclear policy as something 50 individual state legislatures can spontaneously coordinate, it literally collapses federalism into an incoherent free-for-all.
It's absurd.
It is. But Galloway's deeper concern is the damage this does to education and actual policymaking.
Right, because if you allow critics to arbitrarily reassign undeniably federal issues to the states, you choke off real domestic topic research.
You force everyone to spend all their time debating the mechanics of an impossible 50-state miracle, rather than comparing the actual practical merits of the proposed solution.
We spend all our time debating the fantasy of universal agreement, instead of evaluating the intrinsic mechanisms of the policy in front of us.
And the precedent that sets is really dangerous. As the paper concludes, when we allow processes to be redefined, arbitrarily contrived, extrinsic comparisons just dominate the conversation.
And domestic topics routinely get outweighed by wildly speculative scenarios just because the core issues are never actually engaged. So, let's bring this all together. From the zero-sum illusion at the Capitol building, all the way down that winding 50-state road. What is the ultimate takeaway for you listening to this right now?
Well, the primary lesson is about fiercely protecting your decision-making process.
Right. Whether you are a judge in a debate round, a voter evaluating a new policy, or just a person navigating a complex life choice, you have to discard claims that do not establish intrinsic harms or a feasible real-world opportunity cost.
Do not let people distract you from a solid solution by throwing out infinite hypotheticals.
Yes.
If a critic cannot offer a realistic alternative that actually engages with the core problem, an intrinsic alternative, their objection is just an illusion designed to paralyze you.
The 50-state miracle, the sudden collapse of all political capital, the massive butterfly effects, they are the shiny objects of the policy world. They sound smart, they are wrapped up in all this jargon, but they completely dissolve under real-world scrutiny.
They really do.
In a world totally overloaded with information and endless what-ifs, your greatest advantage is the ability to just say, that is an extrinsic concern, and it does not change the intrinsic math of the problem we are actually trying to solve.
Which raises a really important question to leave you with, kind of returning to that image of the crossroads we started with.
Oh, yeah.
If infinite hypotheticals and extrinsic arguments are so remarkably effective at paralyzing national policymaking, how often are you letting completely unrelated anxieties or what-if scenarios paralyze your own personal decision-making?
That is a great point.
The next time you are stuck on a choice, ask yourself, are you debating the intrinsic merits of the problem right in front of you, or are you just bombing a random city to avoid making a move?